The harbor was quiet that evening. The tide moved slowly against the wooden docks, and a faint breeze carried the smell of salt across the small coastal town. Fishing boats rocked gently in the water. A few gulls circled overhead, their cries echoing against the fading light of the sky. Harris Parker walked beside Jordan along the narrow path that followed the harbor's edge. The billionaire CEO kept his hands in his pockets, staring ahead at the water. In boardrooms filled with powerful investors, Harris Parker always knew exactly what to say. But here, walking beside a 6-year-old boy, he felt strangely uncertain. Jordan kicked a small rock along the path as they walked. Tap, tap, tap. The rock rolled ahead of them with each step. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then Jordan broke the silence. "Dad?" Harris glanced down at him. "Yes?" Jordan didn't look up right away. He nudged the rock again with the tip of his shoe. "You said family matters more now." Harris nodded slowly. "It does." Jordan stopped walking. The rock rolled a little farther down the path before coming to a stop near the edge of the dock. Then Jordan finally looked up. His eyes were calm, serious in a way that felt older than 6 years. "Then why do you still live far away?" The question landed like a sudden weight in the air. Harris stopped walking too. For a man who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without hesitation, the simple question left him completely unprepared. Jordan continued quietly. "You stay in the city most of the time." Harris didn't answer. Jordan wasn't accusing him. That made it harder. He was just stating a fact. "You visit us," Jordan said. Another pause. "But you don't live here." Harris looked out at the harbor. The water reflected the last colors of the sunset, stretching across the quiet town that had slowly become more important to him than any skyline. But Jordan was right. Even after everything that had changed, Harris Parker was still living in 2 different worlds. 1 foot in the empire he built, 1 foot in the life he was still learning how to have. And suddenly a 6-year-old boy had exposed the truth with a single question. Harris opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, because he didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense. Jordan studied him for a moment. Then he picked up the rock and tossed it gently into the water. Plop! Ripples spread across the harbor. Jordan shrugged lightly. "Okay." He started walking again down the path as if the conversation were over. But Harris remained standing still, watching the circles spread across the water. Because that small question had just forced him to confront something he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet. He had changed his priorities. But not completely. Not yet. And sometimes the hardest truths don't come from competitors, investors, or headlines. Sometimes they come from a child who is simply trying to understand the world. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever worked so hard building a life that you didn't realize what you were missing while you were building it? A lot of people think success solves everything. Money, power, recognition. But sometimes success just makes it easier to hide the things you avoided. And Harris Parker had spent years avoiding something he didn't even know he had lost. If stories about family, second chances, and the choices that shape our lives mean something to you, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this aren't just entertainment. Sometimes they help us see our own lives a little more clearly. Because Harris Parker's story didn't begin with that question at the harbor. It began weeks earlier, right after the day that changed everything. The day Harris Parker discovered he had 2 sons. The weeks that followed should have been simple. A billionaire meeting his children. But they turned into some of the most uncomfortable weeks of Harris Parker's entire life. Not because of business problems. Not because of financial risk. He had handled crises worth billions of dollars. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for 2 6-year-old boys named Jacob and Jordan. And the truth was, the boys noticed that immediately. The first time Harris Parker visited Justine's home, the twins noticed the car before they noticed him. The black luxury sedan turned slowly onto the quiet street, its polished surface reflecting the soft afternoon sunlight. It looked completely out of place among the modest houses that lined the neighborhood. The engine hummed quietly as the car rolled to a stop in front of Justine's small home. Inside the house, Jacob and Jordan were sitting near the front window. Jacob saw the car first. His eyes widened immediately. He leaned closer to the glass and whispered loudly. "Jordan." Jordan didn't move at first. "What?" Jacob pointed outside. "Look." Jordan walked over beside him and glanced through the window. The sleek car sat perfectly still at the curb. Jacob spoke again, barely containing his excitement. Rich people car. Jordan studied it carefully for a moment. Then he shrugged. He is a CEO. Jacob blinked. Oh yeah. Outside, the driver's door slowly opened. Harris Parker stepped out onto the street. For a moment, he stood beside the car, adjusting the sleeve of his jacket. This kind of arrival had always felt normal to him. City offices, corporate towers, private meetings, but standing on that quiet residential street felt very different. The houses were close together. Children's bicycles leaned against porches. A basketball hoop hung slightly crooked over a garage across the street. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower buzzed faintly. It felt ordinary, but somehow warmer than the penthouse apartment Harris owned in the city. Inside the house, Jacob had already disappeared from the window. The front door burst open. Jacob ran down the small porch steps and straight toward Harris. "You came." Harris looked down just as Jacob reached him. The boy stopped a few feet away, breathing fast from excitement. For a moment, Harris didn't move. He was used to firm handshakes and formal greetings. But not this. Then he nodded gently. "I said I would." Behind Jacob, Jordan stepped out of the house more slowly. He didn't run. He walked down the porch steps carefully, watching Harris the entire time. Jordan stopped beside his brother. "You said you would," he repeated. Harris met the boy's steady gaze. "I keep my word." Jordan tilted his head slightly. "We'll see." For the first time since arriving, Harris almost smiled. The boy's tone was calm, thoughtful. That kind of quiet observation reminded him of someone. Justine. At the front door, Justine stood watching. Her arms were crossed loosely as she leaned against the frame. She hadn't said a word yet, but her eyes followed every movement. Harris noticed her and nodded politely. "Hello, Justine." She returned the nod. "Hello, Harris." Her voice carried no hostility, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was careful, measured. Jacob tugged on Harris's sleeve. "Come inside." Jordan remained where he was, still studying him. Harris walked toward the house, the boys leading the way. As he stepped onto the porch, he glanced back briefly at the car. The black sedan looked like it belonged somewhere else, somewhere far from this quiet neighborhood. Inside the house, the air smelled faintly like something baking. The living room was small but lived in. A worn couch, a coffee table with scattered crayons, a few children's drawings taped to the wall. Nothing expensive, nothing impressive. But something about the space felt real in a way Harris's carefully designed city apartment never had. Jacob had already dropped onto the floor in the middle of the room. Jordan leaned against the arm of the couch. Harris remained standing for a moment, unsure what to do next. He had negotiated with world leaders, but now he was standing awkwardly in a living room with two children watching him. Jacob looked up at him expectantly. Jordan crossed his arms slightly. The silence stretched. Finally, Harris spoke. "So, how has school been?" Jacob blinked. Jordan raised an eyebrow. And somewhere behind them in the kitchen, Justine quietly watched the moment unfold. Because for the first time in his life, Harris Parker was stepping into a world where his usual confidence meant absolutely nothing. The silence in the living room lasted longer than Harris Parker expected. Jacob sat cross-legged on the floor, staring up at him with curiosity. Jordan leaned against the arm of the couch, watching with quiet caution. Justine stood in the kitchen doorway, close enough to hear every word, but far enough to stay out of the conversation. Harris cleared his throat slightly. "So, how has school been?" Jacob blinked. Jordan tilted his head. It was the kind of question adults ask children all the time, but the way Harris said it sounded strangely formal. Jacob scratched the side of his head. Good?" Harris nodded thoughtfully. "What subjects do you enjoy the most?" Jacob looked at Jordan. Jordan looked back at him. Then Jacob answered honestly. "Recess." Jordan laughed. A short, quick laugh that broke the stiffness in the room. Harris paused for a moment, realizing the conversation had already slipped away from the structured direction he had planned. In boardrooms, he asked questions that produced clear answers. Children didn't work that way. Jordan pushed himself off the couch and walked toward the coffee table. "You sound like our teacher," he said. Harris raised an eyebrow. Is that bad? Jordan shrugged. Depends. Jacob grinned. Our teacher talks like that when she wants us to be serious. Harris tried to adjust. All right, he said carefully. What do you like doing after school? Jacob answered instantly. Playing outside. Jordan added calmly. And building things. Harris nodded again. Building things? Jordan pointed toward a small box sitting beside the couch. Inside were scattered plastic pieces and a half-finished model airplane. I'm making that, Jordan said. Harris crouched slightly to look closer. The airplane wasn't perfect, but it was clearly being built with patience. That's impressive, Harris said. Jordan didn't smile. He simply returned to the couch and sat down again. For another moment, the room fell quiet. Harris suddenly realized something uncomfortable. He had spent his entire adult life communicating with executives, lawyers, and investors. None of that experience had prepared him for this. He was approaching his own children the same way he approached business meetings. Structured questions, measured responses. It wasn't working. Jacob seemed to reach the same conclusion. Without warning, he jumped to his feet. Wait here. He ran down the short hallway and disappeared into another room. Harris glanced toward Justine in the kitchen. She didn't say anything, but her expression suggested she was curious to see what would happen next. A few seconds later, Jacob came running back into the living room. In his hands was a slightly worn soccer ball. Before Harris could react, Jacob tossed it straight toward him. The ball bounced once against Harris's chest before he caught it. Play, Jacob said simply. Harris looked down at the ball, then back at Jacob. You want to play soccer? Jacob nodded eagerly. Outside. Jordan stood up slowly. I'll play too. For a moment Harris hesitated. His phone rested quietly in his pocket. His schedule for the day had been carefully organized by assistants hours earlier. He could already imagine the emails waiting for him. But then Jacob ran toward the door. Jordan followed. The boys didn't wait for permission. They simply expected him to join them. Harris looked once more toward the kitchen. Justine leaned lightly against the counter, watching, evaluating. He tossed the ball lightly in his hands once. Then he walked toward the door. Outside, the small yard stretched between the house and a short wooden fence. The grass was uneven. A pair of old sneakers had been placed several feet apart as makeshift goalposts. Jacob ran into position immediately. Jordan stood across from him. Harris stepped onto the grass, still holding the ball. For the first time in years, there were no assistants nearby, no investors waiting, no meeting scheduled. Just a quiet yard, 2 boys, and a soccer ball. Jacob clapped his hands. Come on. Harris placed the ball on the ground. Then he kicked it gently toward Jordan. The boys burst into motion, running, laughing, shouting directions. Harris moved with them, slowly finding the rhythm of the game. The grass brushed against his shoes. The cool air carried the sound of their laughter. Inside the house, Justine stood at the kitchen window. She watched the 3 of them for several moments. Harris Parker looked very different from the man she remembered. Less certain, less controlled, but something else was there too. Something she hadn't expected to see. Harris Parker was trying. The city skyline looked different to Harris Parker now. For years he had admired it from the same angle. Glass towers stretching into the sky. Lights reflecting against polished windows. Traffic moving in smooth lines far below. The view usually reminded him of progress, growth, control. But tonight the skyline felt distant. Harris sat at a quiet table near the window of a private restaurant high above the city streets. The room was calm, softly lit, and nearly empty at this hour. Across from him sat Amelie. She had been studying him for several minutes without speaking. Her posture remained perfectly composed, one hand resting beside a glass of wine that she had barely touched. Finally she spoke. You've changed in 1 week. Harris didn't react immediately. Instead, he looked out at the city again before answering. Probably. Amelie tilted her head slightly. That wasn't the answer she expected. Normally, Harris Parker responded to observations with clarity and precision. Tonight, he sounded reflective. She took a slow sip from her glass. You've been difficult to schedule, she continued calmly. Harris nodded once. My schedule has changed. Yes, Amelie replied quietly. I noticed She leaned back slightly in her chair. For the past 3 years, your calendar has been organized almost down to the minute. Harris gave a faint smile. That sounds accurate. And suddenly, Amelie continued, you've been canceling meetings, rescheduling some. You missed 2 investment briefings. They were handled. Amelie's eyes narrowed slightly, though her voice remained calm. And your assistants told my office that several weekends are now blocked. Harris folded his hands loosely on the table. Yes. Amelie studied him carefully. The man sitting across from her was still Harris Parker. The same billionaire CEO, the same controlled presence, but something in his expression had shifted. It wasn't weakness, it was distraction. Those boys, Amelie said finally. Harris met her eyes. My sons. The words hung between them. Amelie nodded once, accepting the correction. Yes, she said. Your sons. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Below them, the city continued moving as if nothing had changed. But Amelie was calculating something. You've rearranged your schedule around them, she said. Yes, that was fast. Harris didn't argue. He simply said, they're 6. Amelie's gaze sharpened slightly. And they've already lived 6 years without me. That sentence carried a quiet weight. Amelie watched him carefully. You didn't know they existed. That doesn't change the math. Amelie rested her glass back on the table. I understand the emotional reaction. Harris raised an eyebrow slightly. Reaction? Yes, she said calmly. Discovery creates urgency. Harris leaned back slightly in his chair. You think this is temporary? I think it's new, Amelie replied. Her tone remained steady, measured, the way analysts spoke when discussing market shifts. You're adjusting to information, she continued. Maybe, but long-term priorities require stability. Harris didn't respond. Amelie continued speaking, as if she were explaining something important. You lead one of the most valuable companies in the country. Yes, you oversee thousands of employees. I'm aware. And now, she said carefully, your attention is divided. Harris tapped his fingers lightly against the table. They're my sons. Amelie nodded. I know. But she leaned forward slightly. And Harris, you've already started rearranging your life around them. Harris met her eyes again. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Amelie studied his expression for several seconds. Then she said something that shifted the tone of the entire conversation. My father asked me a question yesterday. Harris didn't react yet. What question? Amelie's voice remained calm. He asked whether you are still a reliable investment. The restaurant suddenly felt quieter than before, and for the first time that evening, Harris Parker stopped looking out at the city. The quiet inside the restaurant seemed to deepen after Amelie spoke. My father asked whether you are still a reliable investment. Harris Parker didn't respond right away. The words hung in the air between them, calm and polished on the surface, but heavy with meaning underneath. For a long moment, Harris simply looked at Amelie. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair. Investment, he repeated quietly. Amelie didn't look embarrassed. She didn't rush to correct the statement. Instead, she met his gaze with the same composed expression she had maintained since arriving. That's the word he used. Harris let out a small breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh. Not amused, just unsurprised. The city lights flickered through the tall windows beside them, reflecting against the polished table. Harris finally asked, "And what did you tell him?" Amelie rested her hands neatly on the table. "I told him that you've been distracted recently." Harris tilted his head slightly. That was generous. Amelie gave a faint shrug. It was accurate. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Harris asked another question. "Do you think I'm distracted?" Amelie considered the question carefully before answering. Yes. Her honesty was immediate. "You've changed your schedule." "Yes." "You've started missing meetings." "They were handled." "You've shifted your priorities." Harris didn't deny that. Amelie watched him steadily. "You've spent years building a life that operates with precision," she continued. "Everything you do is strategic." Harris said nothing. "But now," Amelie said quietly, "you're making decisions emotionally." The word lingered between them. Emotionally. In the business world Harris Parker lived in, emotion was rarely considered a strength. Harris folded his hands loosely together. 2 boys appeared in my life. Yes, they're my sons. I understand that. Harris studied her face. Do you? Amelie didn't react defensively. Instead, she answered with the same level tone she had used all evening. I understand the situation. Harris shook his head slightly. That's not the same thing. Amelie held his gaze. No, she admitted. It isn't. Another pause passed between them. Then Amelie continued speaking. My father's concern isn't emotional. Harris waited. He believes stability creates value. That sounds like him. Amelie nodded. He also believes uncertainty weakens partnerships. Harris finally understood exactly where the conversation was going. And our engagement, he said slowly, is considered a partnership. Amelie didn't deny it. Yes. The word landed with quiet clarity. Harris looked down briefly at the table. For years his life had been filled with negotiations, deals, strategic alliances. Every major decision had been evaluated based on growth and advantage. Now he looked at the woman sitting across from him, and for the first time he realized something uncomfortable. Their relationship had followed the same pattern, carefully structured, predictable, advantageous. Amelie watched his expression shift. You didn't notice before, she said calmly. Harris looked up again. No, it wasn't hidden. I wasn't looking. Amelie gave a small nod, accepting that answer. My family values stability, she said. And influence. And influence, Harris repeated. Yes. She didn't soften the statement. That's the world we live in. Harris leaned back slightly. The world where people are evaluated like investments. Amelie met his gaze. That's not entirely unfair. Harris studied her carefully. You're very honest. I prefer clarity. Another silence passed between them. Harris slowly nodded. For most of my life, he said quietly, clarity meant control. Amelie listened without interrupting. But now, Harris continued, I'm starting to realize something. What? Harris looked toward the skyline again. The towering buildings suddenly felt less impressive than they once had. I built a life where everything made sense. Amelie waited, but very little of it was real. Amelie didn't respond right away. She simply watched him. Then she asked a quiet question. So what happens now? Harris turned back toward her. And for the first time since the conversation began, his answer came without hesitation. That depends, he said. On what? Harris held her gaze. On whether this was ever meant to be anything other than a deal. The air between them shifted again, because both of them already knew the answer. For several seconds after Harris spoke, neither of them said anything. The question still lingered between them. On whether this was ever meant to be anything other than a deal. Amelie didn't rush to answer. She lifted her glass again, taking a slow sip before setting it back down on the table with quiet precision. The city lights continued glowing outside the restaurant windows. Down below, traffic moved in steady lines through the streets. The world outside seemed busy and certain, but at their table, something important was shifting. Amelie finally spoke. You want an honest answer. Harris nodded once. Yes. Amelie leaned back slightly in her chair. Her expression remained calm, but her tone carried a different kind of seriousness now. My family values stability, she said again. Harris didn't interrupt. We value influence, she continued. We value partnerships that strengthen long-term position. Harris listened quietly. And when you and I started seeing each other, Amelie added, those factors mattered. Harris gave a small nod. That's clear. Amelie met his gaze. But that doesn't mean the relationship was fake. Harris studied her expression carefully. Then what was it? Amelie considered the question for a moment before answering. It was practical. Harris let out a soft breath. Practical. That word explained more than she probably realized. For years, Harris Parker had built his world around practicality. Smart decisions, calculated moves, partnerships that produced results. But sitting here now, the word felt strangely hollow. He looked at Amelie again. And the wedding? Amelie didn't hesitate. It made sense. Harris leaned back slightly in his chair. That's one way to describe marriage. Amelie noticed the shift in his tone. You're seeing it differently now. Yes, because of the boys. Because of reality, Harris corrected quietly. Amelie watched him closely. And reality is? Harris didn't look away. That my life has been built around things that work on paper. Amelie didn't disagree. But those things built an empire, she said. Yes. And now you're questioning it. Harris shook his head slightly. No. He paused briefly before finishing the thought. I'm questioning what it cost. For a moment, Amelie's calm expression softened slightly. Not with sadness, more like recognition. She had known Harris Parker long enough to understand how unusual this moment was. The man across from her had always been certain about his direction. Now he was reconsidering the foundation of that direction. Finally, Harris spoke again. We shouldn't get married. The words came out steady and direct. Amelie blinked once. Not shocked, just surprised by how clearly he said it. You're serious? Yes. Amelie studied him for several seconds. Then she nodded slowly. I thought this conversation might go there. Harris raised an eyebrow. You did? Yes. She rested her hands lightly on the table again. You've spent the entire evening talking about your sons. They matter. I can see that. Another pause settled between them. Then Amelie asked quietly, Do you know what you're walking away from? Harris didn't hesitate. Yes. A very powerful alliance. I know. Influence. Yes. Stability. Harris gave a small, thoughtful nod. All things I've had for years. Amelie leaned back again. And you're choosing uncertainty instead. Harris thought about the harbor. The small house. The boys running through the yard. Jacob's energy. Jordan's careful questions. Then he answered simply, Yes. Amelie studied his face carefully. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled slightly. You know what's ironic? Harris looked at her. What? I actually respect you more now. Harris didn't respond right away. Amelie continued. For years you were exactly the man my family wanted. And now? She stood from the table. Now you're becoming someone else. Harris watched her pick up her purse. She paused for a moment before leaving. You just stopped being the man powerful families expect. Harris remained seated. And what does that make me? He asked. Amelie looked at him one last time. Maybe the man those boys need. Then she turned and walked away. Harris remained at the table for a long time after she left. The skyline still glowed outside the window. The empire he built was still there. The power, the influence, none of that had changed. But something in his life had quietly shifted. And that chapter of Harris Parker's life ended without headlines, without conflict. Just a quiet decision made across a dinner table high above the city. The weeks after Harris Parker ended his engagement with Amelie became some of the most complicated weeks of his life, not because of the decision itself. That part had been simple, but because of everything that followed. For years, Harris had lived inside a perfectly organized schedule. Every meeting planned, every trip coordinated, every hour assigned. Now that structure was beginning to collapse. Monday mornings still started in the city, the same glass tower, the same executive office overlooking the skyline. But the rhythm of his week had changed. His assistants noticed it first. Harris arrived later than usual, sometimes with traces of sand still on his shoes. Once, one of his assistants quietly placed a stack of meeting documents on his desk and hesitated. Sir, do you want to review these before the investor call? Harris glanced at the papers. Then he looked at the time. What time is the call? In 15 minutes. Harris leaned back in his chair. Send the updated numbers to the team. The assistant blinked slightly. You won't be attending? Not today. That had never happened before. The assistant nodded carefully and left the office. Across the company, people began noticing the pattern. Meetings were being delegated. Decisions were being shared. The company still ran efficiently, but Harris Parker was no longer present in every room. Because several days each week, Harris was somewhere else. The coastal town, a place that had never appeared on his calendar before. On Friday afternoons, his car now drove in the opposite direction of the airport, toward the ocean, toward a quiet neighborhood where two boys were beginning to expect him. Jacob noticed the routine first. One Friday afternoon, as Harris stepped out of the car, the front door of Justine's house flew open. Jacob ran down the steps. You're here again. Harris smiled slightly. I told you I'd visit. Jacob pointed excitedly toward the yard. We have a game tomorrow. Harris raised an eyebrow. A game? Soccer. Jordan appeared in the doorway behind him. You don't have to come, Jordan said calmly. Jacob spun around. Yes, he does. Jordan shrugged. He's probably busy. Harris looked between the two boys. Then he said simply, What time? Jacob's face lit up. 10. Jordan watched Harris carefully. Saturday morning. I'll be there, Harris said. The next morning, Harris Parker stood beside a small soccer field surrounded by folding chairs and parents holding coffee cups. Most of them had no idea who he was. To them, he was simply another father watching a children's game. Jacob ran across the grass with pure energy. Jordan played more carefully, observing the field before making each move. Harris watched both of them with quiet focus. He had attended major corporate conferences across the world. None of them had ever held his attention the way this simple game did. Later that evening, Harris sat at the small dining table inside Justine's house while the boys worked on homework. Jacob struggled with spelling. Jordan focused carefully on math problems. Harris leaned over slightly. Need help? Jacob looked up immediately. Yes. Jordan glanced at him. Maybe. The rhythm of the evening slowly formed. Homework, dinner, occasional soccer games in the yard, simple routines. But while Harris was learning how to exist inside those moments, another reality was forming back in the city. His assistants were working harder than ever. His executive team was taking on more responsibility, and investors were beginning to notice something unusual. Harris Parker was still leading the company, but he was no longer living entirely inside it. For the first time in years, his attention belonged somewhere else. Monday morning arrived with a different kind of tension. The boardroom on the top floor of Harris Parker's company headquarters had always carried a certain atmosphere. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city skyline, and the long polished table reflected the light from the ceiling fixtures like glass. Normally, meetings here ran with perfect precision. Reports were delivered, numbers were discussed, decisions were made. But on this particular morning, something felt slightly different. Harris Parker sat at the head of the table, reviewing a document on the screen in front of him. Around the table sat several members of the company's board, financial partners, long-term investors, people who had built enormous fortunes alongside him. For years they had admired one thing about Harris above everything else: his focus. Nothing distracted him. Nothing interrupted his attention when business was involved. But today, a few of them were watching him carefully. The meeting had already been going for 30 minutes. Profit forecasts, market expansion, operational updates. The discussion moved from one topic to the next with professional efficiency. But Harris had spoken far less than usual. Normally he guided every decision. Today he mostly listened. One investor closed his folder slowly. Harris. The room grew quiet. Harris looked up. Yes? The man leaned back slightly in his chair. You seem distracted. No one else in the room reacted immediately. But several people glanced at Harris. Direct questions like that rarely happened in these meetings. Harris didn't look offended. He simply folded his hands on the table. I'm listening. Another board member spoke next. That isn't the same thing. Harris waited. The first man continued. Your assistants say you've been rearranging meetings, delegating more decisions, missing a few appearances. Harris nodded once. That's accurate. Another voice joined the conversation. Investors have noticed. Harris remained calm. That's understandable. The room grew slightly quieter. One of the older members of the board leaned forward. Harris, is something going on we should know about? For a moment, Harris looked around the table. These were people who had trusted him with enormous responsibility for years. They deserved honesty, so he gave it to them. I'm rebalancing my time. A few people exchanged looks. Rebalancing, one of them repeated. Yes. The older board member tilted his head slightly. For what? Harris didn't hesitate. My sons. The room fell completely silent. Several people looked at each other again. The answer was not what they expected. One investor cleared his throat quietly. You have sons? Yes. How old? 6. Another pause followed. One board member leaned back in his chair and studied Harris with curiosity. And they suddenly appeared in your schedule? Harris answered calmly. They suddenly appeared in my life. The sentence carried enough weight that no one immediately responded. Finally, the older board member spoke again. So your attention is divided? Harris shook his head slightly. No. The man waited for him to explain. Harris continued. For the first time in years, my attention is balanced. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Some of the investors looked uncertain. Others looked thoughtful. Then something unexpected happened. The older board member smiled faintly. Well, he said slowly, it took long enough. A few people around the table chuckled quietly. The tension in the room eased slightly. But the conversation wasn't finished. Another investor leaned forward. You understand what this means for the company? Yes. Leadership requires consistency. I know. And your role here has always been very hands-on. Harris nodded. That hasn't changed. But you're stepping back slightly. Not stepping back, Harris corrected. Adjusting. The older board member crossed his arms. Adjusting to fatherhood. Harris gave a small nod. Yes. For a moment, the room remained quiet again. Then the older man spoke one last time. Well, Harris. He leaned back comfortably in his chair. You built this company. Yes. You trained a very capable executive team. Yes. And if raising two boys is finally forcing you to trust them, the man shrugged slightly. That might not be the worst leadership decision you've ever made. A few quiet laughs moved around the table. The meeting resumed. Reports continued. Decisions were discussed. But something had shifted. For years, the people in that room had known Harris Parker as one thing. A man completely devoted to his empire. Now they were seeing a different version of him. A man whose priorities had begun to change. And whether they approved or not, the change had already started. The evening air along the coastal town felt cooler than the city. Inside Justine's house, the living room lamp cast a warm light across the small table where Jordan sat concentrating on a plastic model airplane. Pieces were spread carefully across the surface. Wings, small screws, a thin tube of glue. Jordan worked slowly, turning the airplane body in his hands as he examined where the next piece should fit. Across from him, Jacob lay on his stomach on the carpet, watching closely. You're doing it wrong, Jacob said. Jordan didn't look up. I'm not. You glued that wing crooked. It's not crooked. Jacob squinted. It's a little crooked. Jordan sighed and adjusted the piece slightly. Across the table, Harris Parker sat in a chair that still felt unfamiliar to him. He had spent years in offices designed with perfect symmetry and polished surfaces. This small living room was different. The table had faint scratch marks from years of use. One of the chair legs wobbled slightly if someone leaned too far to the side. But Harris had begun to feel comfortable here. Jordan carefully pressed the wing into place and held it still while the glue set. Jacob turned his attention toward Harris. You're here a lot now. Harris smiled slightly. I try to be. Jacob rolled onto his back and stared at the ceiling. Mom said you're busy. Sometimes. Jacob nodded. Then he pointed toward Jordan's airplane. When it's done, we're going to fly it. Jordan corrected him without looking up. It doesn't actually fly. Jacob frowned. Then what's the point? Jordan shrugged. It's a model. Jacob considered that explanation. That's a little disappointing. Harris chuckled quietly. Jordan finally placed the airplane down and leaned back in his chair. For a few seconds he studied the model. Then he looked toward Harris. Dad? Harris glanced up. Yes? Jordan didn't speak immediately. He tapped the table lightly with his finger while thinking. Then he asked a question that changed the mood in the room. Why didn't you come earlier? The room fell completely silent. Jacob stopped rolling on the carpet. Jordan wasn't accusing him. His voice carried the same thoughtful curiosity it always did. But the question held weight. Harris didn't answer right away. He looked at the airplane on the table. Then at Jordan. I didn't know you existed. Jordan nodded slowly. That's what Mom said. Jacob sat up quietly now. Jordan continued. But you left Mom. Harris didn't try to avoid the truth. Yes. Jordan studied him carefully. Because of work? Harris took a breath. Yes. Jordan accepted the answer. But he wasn't finished. So work was more important. The honesty of the statement made the room feel heavier. Harris leaned forward slightly in his chair. I thought it was. Jacob watched him carefully now. Jordan kept his eyes on Harris. But now? The question was simple, but it carried more meaning than Jordan probably realized. Harris looked at both boys before answering. Now I know I was wrong. The room remained quiet for several seconds. Jordan studied his face carefully. Jacob leaned forward slightly. Finally, Jordan gave a small nod. Okay. Jacob smiled faintly. Good. Jordan picked the airplane up again and turned it in his hands. The tension slowly faded, but something important had happened. For the first time, Harris Parker had spoken openly about the past with his sons. No excuses, no complicated explanations, just honesty. Jordan carefully placed the airplane back on the table. Jacob leaned closer to inspect it again. You still glued that wing crooked? Jordan sighed. It's not crooked. Harris leaned forward and examined it. Then he said with a slight smile, it might be a little crooked. Jacob burst into laughter. Jordan shook his head. And the quiet evening inside the small house continued. But even with laughter filling the room again, one truth remained clear. Harris Parker was learning something he had never mastered before. How to build something that couldn't be measured in numbers. Trust. And that kind of work always took time. Time passed more quickly than Harris Parker expected. Weeks turned into months. What had once been awkward visits slowly became routine. Friday afternoons now followed a pattern. Harris's car left the city while the sun was still hanging low above the skyline. The long highway stretched toward the coast, carrying him farther away from conference rooms and corporate towers with every mile. By the time the ocean air began to drift through the car window, the tension of the week usually faded. The coastal town moved at a different pace. No rushing traffic, no endless meetings, just quiet streets, small houses, and the distant sound of waves reaching the harbor. At first, Harris had felt like a visitor there. Now the town was starting to recognize him. The same grocery clerk nodded when he walked in. The same coffee shop owner greeted him on Saturday mornings. But the place that mattered most was still the small house where Jacob and Jordan lived. The boys had begun to expect him. One Saturday morning, Harris arrived at the local school field, just as the first soccer game of the day was starting. Parents sat along the sideline in folding chairs. Some held coffee cups, others chatted quietly while watching the children run across the grass. Harris stood near the sideline, hands in his jacket pockets. Jacob spotted him first. Dad! The boy waved excitedly from the field. Jordan glanced toward the sideline and gave a small nod before returning his attention to the game. Jacob played with endless energy, running, shouting, celebrating every small victory. Jordan played differently. He moved carefully across the field, watching everything before making his next move. Harris found himself studying both of them with quiet pride. The game itself didn't matter much. What mattered was simply being there. Later that afternoon, the three of them sat at the small kitchen table inside Justine's house. School books were spread across the surface. Jordan worked through a math worksheet. Jacob struggled through a reading assignment. Harris leaned slightly over Jacob's page. You skipped a word. Jacob squinted at the sentence again. Oh. Jordan glanced over. It's right there. Jacob frowned. I saw it. Jordan didn't argue. He simply returned to his math problems. Across the room, Justine moved quietly between the kitchen and the living room. She rarely interrupted their evenings, but Harris knew she noticed everything. Another month passed. Evenings by the harbor became common. The boys liked walking along the wooden docks, while the boats rocked gently in the water. Jacob usually ran ahead, racing toward the end of the pier. Jordan walked more slowly beside Harris. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. The quiet moments felt natural now. But even as Harris became part of the boys' daily rhythm, another truth remained impossible to ignore. Every Monday morning he still returned to the city, back to the tall office building, back to meetings and decisions and responsibility. Two worlds, two completely different lives. One filled with power and pressure. The other built around homework, soccer games, and evening walks by the harbor. Harris had begun learning how to move between them. But the distance between those two worlds had never truly disappeared. And sooner or later, someone was going to notice. The evening air along the harbor carried the familiar smell of salt and drifting seaweed. The wooden docks creaked softly as the tide shifted below them. Small fishing boats rocked gently against their ropes, and the quiet town settled into the calm rhythm that came after sunset. Harris Parker walked slowly along the harbor path. Beside him, Jordan kicked a small rock forward with the tip of his shoe. Tap. The rock rolled a few feet. Jordan caught up and kicked it again. Tap. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Even after months of visits, Jordan still preferred silence over unnecessary conversation. Jacob had run ahead earlier, chasing the last light of the evening near the end of the dock. Jordan stayed beside Harris, watching, thinking. Finally, Jordan spoke. "Dad?" Harris glanced down at him. "Yes?" Jordan nudged the rock again before asking the question. "You said family matters more now." Harris nodded. "It does." Jordan stopped walking. The rock rolled a few inches farther before settling against the wooden edge of the dock. Harris stopped beside him. Jordan looked out at the harbor water. The fading sunlight stretched across the surface in long reflections. Then he asked quietly, "Then why do you still live far away?" The question landed gently, but it carried more weight than any confrontation Harris had faced in a boardroom. Harris didn't answer immediately. Jordan continued calmly, "You come here a lot." "Yes." "You watch our games." "Yes." "You help with homework." "Yes." Jordan nodded slightly. "But you still live in the city." Harris kept his eyes on the water. "That's where my work is." Jordan accepted the answer, but he wasn't finished. "You said work used to be more important." Harris nodded again. "That's true." Jordan kicked the rock one more time. It slipped off the edge of the dock and disappeared into the water with a soft splash. Jordan looked back up at Harris. "But you said family matters more now." Harris felt the quiet pressure of the moment. Jordan wasn't angry. He wasn't accusing him. He was simply following the logic, a child's logic. Clear, direct. If something mattered more, it should come first. Jordan continued. "So if family matters more." He paused briefly before finishing the thought. "Why don't you live here?" The harbor grew quiet around them. Harris Parker had negotiated with powerful investors for years. He had defended billion-dollar decisions with confidence, but this question left him standing completely still. Because Jordan wasn't wrong. Harris had changed many things. He had rearranged his schedule. He had traveled back and forth every week. He had given time and attention to the boys. But Jordan had just revealed the truth. Harris Parker was still trying to live two different lives. Half in the city, half in the coastal town, half devoted to business, half devoted to fatherhood. Jordan watched him carefully, waiting. Harris finally spoke. "My company is in the city." Jordan nodded. "I know. I have responsibilities there." "I know." Jordan didn't argue with any of that, but he asked the next question anyway. "Can someone else do some of that work?" Harris looked down at him. "Sometimes." Jordan thought about that answer. Then he shrugged slightly. "You said family matters more now." The sentence returned again. Quiet, uncomplicated. Harris didn't respond right away. Jordan studied his face for a moment longer. Then he looked back toward the harbor. "Okay," he said. He turned and began walking down the path again toward the lights of the town. The conversation seemed finished to him, but Harris remained standing where he was, looking out across the water, because in less than 2 minutes, a 6-year-old boy had done something no investor, journalist, or competitor had ever managed to do. Jordan had exposed the one contradiction Harris Parker could no longer ignore. He had changed his priorities, but he hadn't changed his life. Not completely, and now that truth was impossible to avoid. Jordan's question did not leave Harris Parker's mind when the harbor walk ended. In fact, it followed him everywhere. The next Monday morning, Harris sat in his office high above the city streets. The same office he had used for years. Glass walls, a polished desk, the skyline stretching endlessly outside the window. Normally that view gave him clarity, control, a sense that everything in his world was exactly where it needed to be. But that morning the skyline felt distant, because Jordan's voice kept returning to him. "You said family matters more now." Harris leaned back in his chair. The words continued. "Then why don't you live here?" A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. One of his assistants stepped inside. "Your meeting begins in 10 minutes. Harris nodded once. "Thank you." The assistant placed a folder on his desk and left. Harris looked down at the folder. Numbers, reports, strategy proposals. For years those documents had defined the structure of his life. Every decision, every plan, every expansion. But now, even as he opened the folder, his thoughts drifted somewhere else. The harbor, Jacob running across the dock, Jordan walking beside him. The small house where evenings were spent helping with homework. Two different worlds. Harris had spent months convincing himself that he could manage both. But Jordan's question had exposed the flaw in that belief. Because he wasn't truly living in both places. He was dividing himself between them, half present in each, fully committed to neither. The realization sat heavily in his mind. Later that evening, Harris stood alone in his city apartment. The large windows overlooked miles of glowing buildings. Luxury surrounded him. Quiet, perfectly designed, and completely empty. For the first time in years, Harris Parker noticed how silent the space felt. No laughter. No soccer ball rolling across the floor. No children arguing about crooked airplane wings. Just stillness. He walked slowly toward the window and looked down at the city lights. Everything he had built was here. His company, his reputation, the empire that had taken decades to create. Thousands of employees depended on the decisions made in his office. Investors trusted him to lead. The responsibility was enormous. But then he thought about the small house in the coastal town. Two boys sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for him to arrive every Friday afternoon. And one simple question from Jordan. If family matters more, why don't you live here? Harris closed his eyes for a moment. The answer had been obvious the moment Jordan asked it. He had simply been avoiding it. The next several weeks passed with quiet tension. Harris continued traveling between the city and the coastal town. But now every drive carried the same question in his mind. Was he truly changing his life? Or just rearranging it enough to feel better? During one visit, Harris stood beside the soccer field again, watching Jacob run across the grass. Jordan stood nearby, waiting for the next play to begin. The afternoon sun stretched across the field. Parents chatted casually along the sideline. Harris watched the boys carefully. And the realization finally settled completely. His company could survive without him being present every hour. But childhood did not wait. Jacob and Jordan would only be 6 years old once. Those years would pass whether he was there or not. For the first time in his life, Harris Parker faced a decision that no boardroom strategy could solve. It wasn't about profit, or influence, or growth. It was about the kind of life he wanted to live. And more importantly, the kind of father he wanted to become. Sooner or later, he would have to choose. Because Jordan had already revealed the truth. A man cannot live fully in two worlds forever. The announcement came 3 months later. At first, no one outside the company believed it. News outlets reported it cautiously. Financial analysts repeated it carefully. Because the headlines sounded almost impossible. Harris Parker was stepping down as active CEO. Inside the company headquarters, the reaction was immediate. Phones rang across multiple floors. Executives moved quickly between offices. Assistants whispered in hallways. For years, Harris Parker had been known for one thing above everything else: control. He built the company from nothing into one of the most powerful corporations in the country. Every major decision had passed through his office. Every strategic move carried his signature. And now the news spreading across financial networks was saying something different. Harris Parker would remain the owner. He would remain chairman of the board. But daily leadership of the company would move to the executive team he had trained for years. The official statement was short, carefully written, professional. It explained that Harris wanted to focus on long-term strategic oversight. But inside the company, people knew the change was larger than that. Late that afternoon, Harris sat in the same boardroom where he had spent countless hours guiding the company's direction. The city's skyline stretched beyond the windows. The long table was filled with familiar faces, senior executives, board members, people who had worked beside him for decades. No one spoke at first. Finally, one of the board members leaned forward. "You're serious about this?" Harris nodded. "Yes." Another executive frowned slightly. This company grew because of your leadership. It will continue growing. With you stepping back? Yes. The room remained quiet. One board member adjusted his glasses. This is happening sooner than we expected. Harris folded his hands calmly on the table. The leadership team is ready. Another executive asked carefully. And you're comfortable with the transition? Yes. The older board member, who had questioned Harris months earlier, spoke next. This isn't just about delegation, is it? Harris looked at him. No. The man waited. Harris continued. For years, I believed leadership required being present everywhere. Several people around the table nodded. That belief helped build this company. Another executive added quietly. It also built your reputation. Harris acknowledged the point. But leadership also means knowing when something more important requires your time. The room grew silent again. One executive spoke carefully. Your sons. Harris didn't hesitate. Yes. The admission settled across the room. Several people exchanged quiet looks. Not judgment. Understanding. The older board member leaned back slightly in his chair. Well, he said slowly. That explains the timing. Harris looked around the table. For years we built this company together. Heads nodded around the room. You're capable of leading it forward. Another executive finally spoke. And you? Harris gave a small smile. I'll still be involved. The man shook his head slightly. That's not what I meant. Harris understood the real question. What will you do now? For a moment, Harris Parker looked toward the skyline, the city where he had built everything. Then he answered simply, I'm going to be a father. No one in the room laughed. No one dismissed the statement, because everyone sitting at that table understood exactly what it meant. Harris Parker wasn't abandoning his empire. He was choosing where his life truly belonged. And for the first time in decades, that choice had nothing to do with business. The news continued spreading across financial media for days. Business channels replayed the announcement repeatedly. Analysts debated the decision during long segments filled with speculation. Some believed Harris Parker was preparing for a larger strategic shift. Others insisted the move was temporary. A few suggested the company might face internal instability without his daily leadership. None of them understood the real reason. Because the real reason was not located in the city. It was nearly 3 hours away, in a quiet coastal town where 2 6-year-old boys were finishing school for the day. The decision Harris had made inside the boardroom did not feel dramatic to him. It felt simple, necessary. For the first time in years, his calendar was no longer packed with endless obligations. Meetings still existed. Responsibilities had not disappeared. But the weight of constant presence was gone. 3 weeks after the announcement, Harris drove along the familiar coastal highway again. The road curved gently along the ocean. The same stretch of water he had passed many times before now felt different. Because this time, he was not just visiting. He was arriving. The house stood a few streets away from the harbor. Not large, not extravagant. Just a simple home with wide windows facing the water. When Harris stepped out of the car, the late afternoon breeze carried the sound of waves moving against the docks. He opened the front door and walked inside. The space was quiet, empty for the moment. A couch near the window. A small kitchen. A wooden table where homework would probably happen. The house did not resemble the luxury apartments Harris had owned in the city. But something about the space felt calm, real. He placed his keys on the counter and looked around slowly. For years, Harris Parker had purchased properties that symbolized success. Penthouse views. Architectural perfection. This house meant something entirely different. A knock suddenly echoed through the front door. Before Harris could reach it, the door burst open. Jacob ran inside first. You live here now. His voice filled the room with excitement. Jordan stepped in behind him, calmer but equally curious. They both looked around the house. Jacob ran toward the window immediately. You can see the harbor. Harris laughed quietly. Yes. Jacob spun around again. This is awesome. Jordan walked slowly across the living room, examining the space carefully. He paused near the couch. Mom said you moved. Harris nodded. I did. Jordan studied his face for a moment. Not just visiting? No. Jordan glanced around the house again. You're staying here. Yes. Jacob jumped onto the couch with a loud bounce. We can play here. Jordan didn't react to the excitement right away. He continued looking around thoughtfully. Finally, he said something that carried more weight than his brother's enthusiasm. You really stayed? Harris crouched slightly, so he was closer to eye level with both boys. I told you I would. Jacob grinned. Jordan held his gaze for another quiet moment. Then he nodded slowly. Okay. The words sounded simple. But, for Jordan, acceptance rarely came quickly. Jacob had already begun exploring the house. Opening doors. Running from room to room. This room is huge. Jordan walked toward the window overlooking the harbor. The boats moved gently in the distance. For several seconds he simply watched the water. Then he turned back toward Harris. A small smile finally appeared on his face. Then welcome to the family. Harris stood there for a moment, absorbing the words. The house was still simple. The future still uncertain. But something inside that room had shifted permanently. For the first time in his life, Harris Parker was no longer arriving somewhere temporarily. He was home. The evening settled quietly over the coastal town. Soft orange light from the setting sun stretched across the harbor, reflecting against the calm water. Boats moved gently with the tide, their ropes creaking softly against the wooden docks. Inside the small house near the harbor, Jacob's laughter echoed through the living room. A soccer ball rolled across the floor. Pass it. Jacob shouted. Harris tapped the ball back toward him with his foot. Jacob chased it immediately, sliding across the rug, as if the house had already become a soccer field. Jordan stood near the window, watching the game for a moment before shaking his head. You're going to break something. Jacob didn't slow down. No, we're not. Harris smiled. Jordan finally stepped forward and stopped the ball with the side of his shoe. See? That was going toward the lamp. Jacob laughed. Jordan rolled the ball back toward him anyway. Across the yard outside, the porch light of Justine's house glowed softly as evening approached. A short time later, there was a knock at the door. Jacob ran to open it. Mom. Justine stepped inside, carrying a small grocery bag. Her eyes moved around the room slowly. She noticed the soccer ball, the scattered shoes, the laughter. Then her gaze settled on Harris. You're settling in quickly. Harris gave a small shrug. I'm learning. Jacob grabbed the grocery bag. What's for dinner? Justine laughed softly. Easy there. Jordan took the bag from his brother and carried it to the kitchen. Jacob followed behind him immediately. For a moment, Harris and Justine stood alone in the living room. She crossed her arms lightly. You actually did it. Harris nodded. Yes. Justine looked toward the kitchen, where the boys were arguing quietly about where to put the groceries. You stepped away from the company. I stepped back, Harris corrected. She glanced back at him. That's a big difference. He smiled slightly. It is. Justine studied him carefully for a moment. Do you understand what this means? Yes. You won't be able to hide behind work anymore. I know. Her eyes softened slightly. That's a good thing. Harris leaned against the wall near the doorway. You trusted me with this. Justine looked toward the kitchen again. I'm still watching. Harris laughed quietly. Fair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the boys' conversation drifted through the house. Jordan explaining something carefully. Jacob disagreeing loudly. Justine nodded toward the kitchen. You don't have to prove anything to me. Harris looked at her. Who do I prove it to? Justine didn't hesitate. Them. Her voice remained calm but firm. They're the only ones who matter. Harris nodded slowly. Outside, the last light of the sunset faded across the harbor. Inside the house, the kitchen lights flickered on. Jacob suddenly appeared in the doorway. Dinner is ready. Jordan stepped out behind him. You mean Mom made dinner? Jacob shrugged. Same thing. Harris followed them toward the kitchen. Justine walked beside him. For years, Harris Parker had been known across the country for building one of the most powerful companies in the business world. Financial magazines still wrote about him. Analysts still studied his decisions. People would continue talking about the billionaire CEO who stepped away from daily power. But none of those headlines captured the real story. Because Harris Parker's greatest achievement was not measured in stock prices or corporate growth. It was measured in moments like this. A small kitchen, two boys laughing across the table, and a man who finally understood what success actually meant. Years later, when people asked Harris Parker about the greatest thing he had ever built, he never mentioned the company. He never talked about boardrooms or investors. Instead, he would point toward the yard where two boys were kicking a soccer ball across the grass. And he would say something simple: "Those are my sons." And if this story reminded you that success isn't just about what you build, but also about who you show up for, share your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes the most important decisions in life are not about gaining something, they're about choosing what truly matters.